Hi, thank you all so much for coming this evening. As you can see, there is plenty to cover, so we're going to jump right in. So far this morning, we looked at what we do when we don't have answers, and then just heard a beautiful foundation given for how the gospel should help us think about this. And then Dr. Schultz and I are going to be looking at what actually happens to the body in trauma. How do we understand that? And I think that's critical for a couple of reasons. First, when we better understand the relationship between our mind and our body and our soul, we can better glorify our Creator. We appreciate the complexity of God's creation. Second, if we want to become a trauma-informed church, and a church that is safe for survivors, we have to understand what that looks like in practicality. And third, for those of us who have been through trauma, this kind of knowledge is incredibly helpful in starting to unravel what we have experienced. And also for all of us to start looking at how sometimes the church gets this wrong theologically, right? So we're going to be focusing specifically on the impact on the body. So what is the damage from trauma? Well, it's extensive, and it goes far beyond any physical injury that might have occurred. Sexual assault is one of the most common forms of violence, and also a significant feature in domestic violence as well. And compared to peers who have experienced trauma other than sexual assault survivors are 3 times more likely to suffer from depression, 6 times more likely to suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, the only category in our country that outpaces PTSD diagnoses are combat veterans. Sexual assault survivors come in second only to combat veterans. Sexual assault survivors are 13 times more likely to abuse alcohol, 26 times more likely to abuse drugs, and 4 times more likely to contemplate or attempt suicide. Out of every crime committed on a victim who survives, sexual assault tends to cause more harmful psychological effects than any other crime. And what this looks like is going to be individual for each survivor, but there are a couple of threads that we need to be aware of. First, survivors tend to feel a deep sense of shame and guilt, often feeling the need to be punished. This helps us understand why so many survivors engage in intentionally risk-taking behaviors or destructive or self-harming behaviors. For many survivors, this includes engaging in further abusive relationships, including sexually abusive relationships. This might range from struggling with pornography, often violent, though not always, to living in a cycle of abusive relationships, to engaging in the adult sex industry. Nearly every sexual assault victim will struggle at some point with some level of sexual manifestation of the damage. And oftentimes this comes from 2 lies that victims believe. First, this is all I am worth. And second, an attempt to regain some form of control over their sexuality. To a sexual assault survivor at a subconscious level, oftentimes it feels like if I can at least initiate the sexual encounter or the relationship, even an abusive one or an unhealthy one, at least I am wielding my sexuality rather than having it wielded against me. And when as Christians we simply apply Bible verses about lust to a survivor that is struggling with sexual addiction or sexual manifestation, we have grossly misdiagnosed what is going on. And oftentimes we take these same behaviors and we use them as evidence that the abuse hasn't occurred. Oh, she sleeps with everyone. She must have slept with him too. Rather than realizing what we are seeing is oftentimes a manifestation of the deep damage that has been done. This looks like PTSD manifestations, anxiety, panic attacks, and flashbacks. And the best way I can help you understand that, if you haven't experienced this, is to talk a little bit about the neurobiology of trauma. See, our brains and our bodies are always forming neural connections in response to what we are experiencing around us. And the more we experience that thing, or the more powerful that experience is, the stronger those neural connections are. And if I want you to take just a minute and think back to a positive childhood memory that you have. Take just a second and think about something you enjoyed doing in your childhood. Now, most likely when you recall that memory, you recall it as a two-dimensional type of image. You will probably remember what you felt or what you smelled or what you heard. You will have a level of emotional response to it, but it's a largely two-dimensional experience, like watching an emotionally engaging movie. But research has shown us that traumatic memories are stored and accessed differently in the brain. The brain scans of a trauma survivor experiencing a flashback all actually mirror the brain scans of a stroke victim. Entire regions of the brain that should be lighting up have gone completely dark. In particular, the regions that help us process auditory input and verbal output. This helps us understand why a survivor experiencing a traumatic memory resurfacing may not be able to process what you are telling them to help them recognize that they are safe. They may be recalling that memory in a way that seems very incoherent or irrational or illogical, because the regions of the brain that should be processing that auditory input and helping them give verbal output have gone dark. And at the same time, regions of the brain that should not be lighting up, especially the region that is processing current sensory input, should not light up during memory recall, is blaring. And what this means is that when that traumatic memory resurfaces, it doesn't resurface as a two-dimensional experience. It resurfaces as a full-body, three-dimensional immersive experience. This is happening to me right now. Which means that a survivor's body enters and re-enters that trauma over and over and over again. And just like positive childhood memories can be triggered when we re-experience something that we experienced at the same time as a positive memory, traumatic memories are triggered the same way. So I'm going to give you the most evangelical Baptist explanation I can give you. I love the smell of pot roast. And if any of you were raised in evangelical Baptist traditions, you understand that the two most Baptist things you can smell are potlucks and pot roast. And the reason I love the smell of pot roast is because every Sunday or many Sundays, we would go to my grandparents' house after church. They lived just a couple hours away from us, so we would leave directly from church and we'd drive there. And I have the most vivid memories of coming out of the cold Michigan winter into the warmth of my grandmother's kitchen and smelling the Sunday roast that she had made for dinner. And whenever I smell the smell of pot roast, I can't help but smile because it reminds me of my grandma. And my grandma was safe, and I loved her. And when I smell pot roast, I don't just remember the emotions that I feel towards my grandmother. I remember all of the other things I experienced at the same time. I remember the warmth of her kitchen and the smell of her perfume and the sound of her voice when she would turn around from the kitchen sink. I'm so glad you made it. And when I smell pot roast, I don't tell my brain and body, pot roast reminds you of your grandmother. You loved your grandmother. She was safe. Brain, please release dopamine and serotonin and make me feel happy right now. Right? I don't do that on purpose. That's what my body does because that's what God designed my body to do. And in the same way, when a traumatic memory resurfaces, it triggers a flood of chemical realities for the survivor. The cortisol and the adrenaline pump through your body, telling you something is not safe, something's very wrong. Survivors' bodies often live in a state of constantly flooded stress hormones. A survivor's blood work looks very different than someone who has not survived extensive trauma. And our bodies and our organs were not made to sustain that type of constant influx of stress hormones. This means that for many survivors, chronic health conditions often develop. Digestive issues, heart issues, autoimmune diseases. And these are not choices that survivors make. In the same way that I don't tell my brain and body to experience or to release serotonin and dopamine, I don't tell my brain and body to re-trigger a traumatic memory and flood my body with stress hormones. It just happens. And as a result, many survivors are going to develop coping mechanisms to try to deal with the level of intrusive flashbacks. Everything from biting their tongue or cutting themselves to try to feel something other than what they are re-experiencing in that flashback, to very practical measures like wearing a belt at night or compulsively rearranging the furniture every evening to block all of the windows and doors just to try to feel safe enough to sleep. Wearing tennis shoes when they go to bed so that they are ready to run at a moment's notice. Life in general looks very different for a survivor of abuse. And because those traumatic memories form with any kind of input, it is critically important that we be aware of what that looks like so that we can help avoid those things, especially in a spiritual context. For survivors who have experienced sexual abuse or spiritual trauma from a leader, oftentimes that trigger can be the Bible verse that was read from the pulpit the day the youth minister found them in the stairwell, or the song that was being sung the day that that happened, or the way that he used to pray when it was finished. The things that you and I would normally look to for comfort often are very triggering for survivors of abuse. And if we don't understand that as the body of Christ, we will unintentionally do incredible damage. And the other reality is that survivors not only have a heightened sense of stress hormones flooding their body, they also often lack the coping mechanisms that we typically develop to calm down. So I want you guys to think of something just for a minute that you do to help relieve stress. Somebody shout out a couple things. What do you do to help relieve stress? Exercise. What else? Sorry? Yell. Yep. Find some kind of physical expression of what you're feeling. Hey, I'm a mom. I get it. Sometimes that might happen at my house. I like cupcakes. I like rock climbing. Music. Anybody listen to music? Okay. Music is great. And sometimes for me, it's something as simple as telling my husband I need a hug. And no matter what's going on, when Jacob wraps his arms around me, I can feel my body start to relax. He's awesome. He's over there. I can feel my body start to relax, right? And I don't tell my brain and body to do that. I don't tell my brain, your husband is safe, you love your husband, release serotonin and dopamine. My body learned to do that because for the vast majority of my life, physical touch from the men in my life was safe. I had the opportunity to form those healthy neural connections, and I had the chance to go back to them after my abuse. But for many survivors of abuse, they did not have the chance to form those neural connections. So not only do they live in a state of heightened hypervigilance where their body is being constantly flooded with the stress hormones and they have these triggers for bringing up traumatic memories constantly, they also lack the normal neural connections to help balance those things out. And what I want to help you understand through just a glimpse of those physical realities is that walking well with a survivor of abuse takes an incredible amount of knowledge and intentionality. But when we study and we learn about the complexity of how God has designed us, it keeps us from unintentionally doing things with our theology that can cause massive amounts of harm, from misdiagnosing problems, from misapplying Bible verses, and it gives us the compassion and the knowledge we need to walk well with those who have suffered.
So I'm going to turn and talk a little bit about ways to calm our defense responses, as we've been talking about the various ways trauma impacts our bodies. And some of the ways of responding to our fight, flight, and freeze responses. So when we do perceive there to be danger or trauma, the amygdala in our brain, which is the alarm center in our brain, initiates the defense responses, like our pupils are dilated, our chest, our breathing is shorter, and the blood leaves the stomach and the intestines, and it goes to the parts of the body that need that, like the brain and the heart and our muscles. So we can fight, or we can run, or we can freeze like a rabbit, waiting till the perpetrator goes away. And I'm glad God designed our body in this way to help us respond when we're afraid, when danger lurks around. The problem is, as Rachel was talking about it, sometimes the amygdala or the defense responses in our bodies can get stuck or overactivated, or what's called as hijacked. And when that happens, the amygdala can begin to register danger when there really is no danger, because fear often spreads. It doesn't often stay in its box. And we can also begin, or alternatively, we can respond out of proportion to the situation at hand. And the problem is that for many of us, as Rachel was saying, this happens over and over and over again. And this becomes a way of life. This becomes, we're constantly on guard. Our bodies are on guard. But the problem is that our defense systems were meant to be temporary, not to be fully activated all the time. And what also happens here is that constant or that continual release of stress hormones in the body, like adrenaline and cortisol. And when that happens, when we're constantly having those stress hormones released, this can contribute to high blood pressure. This can contribute to heart disease. This can contribute to chronic inflammation in the body or sleep disturbances. And chronic inflammation or chronic activation of the stress responses is kind of like the motor in the car idling too high for too long. It's hard on the motor in the car, and it's hard on the body. And so I want to talk about a few ways to calm our defense responses. It doesn't resolve the original trauma, but there are ways to calm us and quiet us so that ultimately we can deal with the meaning of trauma. We can begin to process, because trauma often teaches us lies about ourselves, about others, and about God. So a caveat as I'm telling you some of these responses, it always needs to be an individualized response. There's not a one-size-fits-all what works with everybody. But the first one I want to tell you about is soothing breathing, or diaphragmatic breathing, or belly breathing, sort of synonyms for the same thing. When I used to hear about soothing breathing, I used to think this was sort of woo-woo stuff. Counselors come up with woo-woo stuff sometimes. But actually, when I began to learn how God designed the brain and the body, I learned that He designed us for a way to calm our body, to quiet our body. And part of this is because of the vagus nerve in the body. It's the longest cranial nerve in the body. And when it's activated, it takes about 45 seconds for the vagus nerve to be activated and slowly go up to the amygdala in the brain and begin to turn down the alarm center in the brain, which is the amygdala, to begin to turn it down. But it takes about 45 seconds just to activate it. And how that happens, I find it very interesting, is when we take a deep belly breath, we fill our lungs with air, and when our lungs fill with air, the diaphragm drops. And when our diaphragm drops, it slightly squeezes the internal organs in our body. And wrapped around the internal organs is the vagus nerve. And when it's squeezed, it begins to activate and slowly go up to the brain to turn it down. And so some of the benefits of deep breathing is that it's always available, it's free, and also that we get more oxygen and we exhale more carbon dioxide. But the key is that we can't activate the vagus nerve with shallow chest breathing. We can only activate it in terms of breathing with deep diaphragmatic breathing. So it's kind of like deep breathing or shallow breathing. It's kind of like rowing a boat. You can get somewhere if you do 1 billion short strokes, but that pales in comparison with fewer, longer strokes. So, last thing to say about deep breathing is that neuroscience tells us that if we practice deep breathing 15 to 20 minutes every day, over 15 weeks, that actually can change the neural pathways in our brain. But it's much shorter with symptom release. Again, only about 45 seconds to begin to quiet us in some of the symptom relief. So one example, there's so many ways to do deep breathing. You've probably all heard of a million ways. But one way is box breathing, and that's simply visualizing breathing around a box. Breathing, inhaling for 4 to 5 seconds. Holding for 4 to 5 seconds. Exhaling for 4 to 5 seconds, and starting over again. Inhaling, holding, exhaling. So a caveat here, and that is with deep breathing. Sometimes people tell me as a therapist, when I'm walking with people, deep breathing doesn't work for me. And that can be because we've spent a lifetime of shallow chest breathing. We've spent a lifetime in the defense response. And so if we begin to do deep breathing, it can kind of feel weird. And so we have to practice that. Ask any athlete or any musician. We need to practice something. Ask any water polo player to shoot a ball into the net. You got to practice over and over and over again. It also could be because sometimes people say it doesn't work is because when we've done chest breathing a lot of our lives, we have strong chest muscles, but we have oftentimes weak diaphragm muscles. And so we need, again, to practice and exercise those diaphragm muscles. Also, it could be because people may have other medical illnesses, and sometimes, like with heart disease, deep breathing can be contraindicated. So we always need to work with a provider to determine what is best for that person. But last, in terms of deep breathing, when we may invite some survivors to begin to engage and relax and engage in deep breathing, for some that's triggering, not relaxing. Because when they were relaxed, or when they were asleep, or when they were not on guard, something dangerous happened to them. And so they learn it's not okay not to be on guard. So when that happens and relaxing is dangerous, it's like playing with matches. When that happens, we need to do other things first before we can get to deep breathing. So again, always an individualized response first. A second way to calm some of our defense mechanisms is pairing certain prayer practices with deep breathing. So I had a praying mom. She prayed more than anybody I know on earth. I never remember her preaching a sermon to me about prayer. She just prayed. But she also had a life of suffering, and her suffering is what pressed her close to Jesus. And so her life inspired me so much that I love to study empirical research to find out about how prayer practices can impact our mental health and our physical health. And you know what? It turns out certain prayer practices can decrease anxiety and promote hope. And so two ways to promote or to pair diaphragmatic breathing and prayer practices. One being breath prayers, where we inhale the name of God silently and we exhale our request. And oftentimes, long times prayers, they begin to do the diaphragmatic breathing as they pray. And so also we can do that with a verse of inhaling a short verse and exhaling the request to God. God, help me. And sometimes that's all we can say. And then there's also prayer walks. It's another way of doing that. And I have 2 friends every week that I go on a prayer walk on Thursday afternoons and Sunday afternoons. One of my dear beloved friends, Hannah, who's here today, we went on a prayer walk this morning. And I believe we all need somebody in our life who won't judge us, who will hear. We pour out our sorrows to, we can share, and we can do that diaphragmatic breathing, and we can talk to God and then pour it out to Him and do exercise at the same thing. So let's also take a little look at exercise, because that's a third way of helping to quiet our defense responses. But I'm not talking about here the cardiovascular benefits of exercise. I'm talking about the quieting benefits of exercise. And I want to talk with you a little bit about squirrels. Squirrels, you say? What's interesting is that squirrels and other small animals like rabbits and birds, oftentimes in the wild, they get scared 20 to 30 times a day. But interesting, a lot of small animals in the wild don't develop PTSD, which is interesting. And if you've ever watched a squirrel and a predator comes along like a hawk or a golden doodle, if you've ever watched a squirrel, what they do is they stop and they run up a tree and then they sit on a branch, and if the predator leaves and goes away, if you keep watching the squirrel, you'll watch something very interesting, and that is that they begin to shiver and shake. And what they're doing is they're actually shivering and shaking that sympathetic activation, sympathetic nervous activation. They're shaking it off. It looks like Taylor Swift was on to something when she told us that we need to shake it off. And literally, I believe, the question is how many of you have been stressed at all over the last 2 weeks? How many of you have, that's all of us. Else, if you didn't put up your hand, we're not telling the truth, right? And I believe we all need to shake it off on a daily basis. I love to walk every day because of stresses, of little stresses, big stresses, to walk off and shake it off. But again, reminder, aerobic exercise doesn't resolve the original trauma. But it can quiet our bodies in order so that we can eventually get to the place of processing the trauma in our body. Last major thing, and that is diet. Hippocrates said, "Let food be thy medicine, and medicine be thy food." And I'll tell you a little bit about, you've probably heard it at different times, but a little bit about the difference between processed carbohydrates and complex carbohydrates. Processed carbohydrates, things like white bread, white flour, white rice, cookies, cakes, ice cream, pretzels, all the things we love, right? And the thing about processed carbohydrates is that they're utilized more quickly in the body. And that means we don't get as full as quickly. But the most important thing about processed carbohydrates is that it results in spikes and drops in the blood sugar levels in our body. And so that drop can lead us to feeling more anxious and agitated. And also, processed foods are stripped of nutritional value. And so that, for example, like white flour, when they process white flour, the kernel of the wheat is removed and 20 nutrients are removed. And so it's literally left with no nutritional value after they process white flour. So compare processed carbohydrates with complex carbohydrates. And complex carbohydrates, things like quinoa, fresh vegetables, fresh fruit, legumes. And what about processed or complex carbohydrates? The body digests complex carbohydrates more slowly. So it means we don't have as sharp as jumps and drops of sugar in the body. And you know when you hear about that glycemic index? And glycemic index is actually classified by how quickly the sugar in the body drops. And so one of the ways that we can actually quiet the body is utilizing or digesting more complex carbohydrates versus more processed carbohydrates. Last few things, give you a few more examples of other ways to calm our body. Those are walking and being mindful in nature. Sometimes when we walk, I can look just at the pathway and I fail to look at the trees and hear the birds and see the beauty all around us. Other ways of writing down in a prayer journal can be a way of quieting some of us. And again, different things work for different people. Gentle stretching, gentle stretching or yoga can be quieting. Warm water, how many of you like a warm bath or a warm shower? Soothing, something rhythmical, like rocking in a hammock or swinging or gently bouncing on a trampoline, ways to rock us and soothe us. And music, soothing music or calming music, or sounds that are calming, like the sound of waterfalls or laughing children, can all be calming ways. And the last one is certain smells, like essential oil, certain calming smells. And that's because all of our senses go directly to the thalamus in the brain, except for one sense, the sense of smell. It goes directly to the amygdala, that alarm center in our brain. And so when we can have soothing smells, I know some folks, when they get stressed, they'll smell those essential oils, and that can quiet them. 2007, last item. It was the Super Bowl between the Indianapolis Colts and the Chicago Bears. And it was a rainy, rainy night. Peyton Manning won the most winning quarterback award that evening. And that's because the football was only intercepted once, and it was fumbled only once. And that's because all year long, every couple of weeks, Peyton would practice with a center who would snap the ball. And I know nothing about football, but I read. He would snap the ball, water-soaked footballs to him, and he'd practice handling water-soaked footballs. And so he was prepared, even though half the football games are played in domes, but he practiced and practiced. You and I live, I suggest, in tropical rainstorms of stress on a daily basis. And we need to practice certain ways of quieting our defense responses so we can be prepared for the rainy days in our lives. Thank you.
And we've got just a couple minutes left, it looks like. So what I hope this really helps you see is the complexity of how God has created us, and also to identify some ways that we as Christians have gotten it a little bit wrong, right? One of the things that I grew up hearing quite a bit in my circles was likening trauma to a thought wound, and being told if you would respond the right way, if you would think the right things, if you would fill your mind with truth, you wouldn't have these responses anymore, right? And so one of the things that learning about the neurobiology of trauma and how our bodies work, how God has designed it really does for us, is it takes trauma out of that realm of thought wound only and puts it much more properly into soul wound, thought wound, and body wound. And one of the things that I find most helpful when I'm working with pastors or evangelical leaders or even survivors to help retrain their own thought processes is asking them, what would you do if you could see the wound that you have right now? Imagine that you know someone who is in a catastrophic car accident, right? And they have a spinal cord injury, and they needed a cane or they were in a wheelchair. If you could see that injury, would you tell that person, oh, if you would just forgive? Right? Forgiveness can be part of the process that the survivor goes through. And there are incredible benefits spiritually and freedom that is found in trusting God's justice. But it does not make the broken bone stop hurting. It does not make the injury go away. Right? You can look at what a survivor has gone through. If you could see that injury, would you say to the survivor, why do you need medicine anyways? Or would you recognize that for an injury that severe, sometimes medication is going to be necessary to help lessen the symptoms of that injury so that healing can take place? Would you say, my spinal surgeon has to be a Christian or they don't have the knowledge needed to help me heal? right? We don't treat physical injuries that way. And we know that we can hold to the doctrine of the sufficiency of Scripture and still see a spinal surgeon who maybe isn't a Christian, right? We know that we can hold to the truth of the sufficiency of Scripture and still take pain medication for our injury. We know that we can hold to the sufficiency of Scripture and still do everything right, and the physical injury is still there because we live in a broken and fallen world. And so part of what I hope you walk away with tonight is a deeper appreciation and worship for the complexity of our Creator, but also some foundational tools to be able to properly put trauma where it belongs, recognizing the interplay of soul and spirit and body, and helping think better theologically about how we respond to trauma as Christians.